Hi, in this video I'm going to show you different ways of backing your handmade buttons. This is an edited upload of my first Facebook Live over in the Gina-B Silkworks group. So there may be the odd reference to comments that I'm receiving in real time. Let's get started. So all of you are making buttons, and I know that, like me, especially if you're adding lots of thread and things like that, you've got messy backs. That's all there is to it. They just end up really messy. Hi again, Helen. And so I thought that I would go over some ideas for how you can actually add nice tidy backs. Hello, Minako. I'm going to need chocolate after this as well. So some of the different things that you can do for your buttons. The most sort of basic is to add, let's get this lined up, right about there, is to simply add a back. So these are both ring buttons, and because they're singleton buttons, I've just put a little padded bit of fabric that matches, turned under the edges, and popped those onto the back. And so you can either stitch right through to add, to actually add this to the garment or whatever else, or you can add a shank. Okay. I will show you some of these different things. I just thought that what I would do is discuss some of the options first. Now, a little bit moving on from that is to have the fabric back, but using a stiff, let's get that in focus, but using a stiff item. So for instance, like this, to use, I've used card on this one. So I've covered a piece of card with fabric and then stitched that to the back. So that makes a nice tidy finish as well. That, moving on, you can use card or interfacing as well in the same way for shaped buttons. And that really is possibly the easiest way to add it back onto a shaped button, is to actually cover with fabric. Now, of course, these are flat. There isn't a shank on these, but I'm going to show you how to add some shanks as well. Okay, so that's another option. Then we've got the addition of shanks. So with this, for instance, you can see that there's a metal shank, but then it's fabric covered. This is a really nice way of finishing off, and you can use actual backs from buttons and then just cover those over. And so that gives a really nice professional finish. You can glue or stitch or both, which I usually do because I don't trust glue. Let's see. You've got backs such as these, which are a plastic back that can be glued onto the back. And that, obviously, you have to work it out to the size. Again, if you're a little bit worried about using just glue, because you do have to use a really strong glue, you have to use a super glue. I tend to use a Gorilla Glue, which I've left at the unit, so I'm not going to be actually illustrating any of that today. And of course, the benefit with the plastic is if you do want to sign, you can sign them more easily. The fabric you can sign as well, but we'll go over that in a moment too. Now this is also a plastic back, but the plastic back has been covered over with fabric. Okay, now this is something, if you go to these places that do cover buttons for you, the real designer ones, they will also cover the back with the fabric as well as the front. And so that's a nice way you can use any of the backs that way. It also gives you that fabric so that you can also stitch as well as glue. So that's a nice one. Let's see, that's another, that is actually the shape of the back, this type of back that when it's covered over. So you've got a lot of options with that as well. Other thing that you can do is you can work, let me see if you can see this one. You can work a thread base. This particularly works well with fabric buttons, and it mimics the Victorian buttons that had a wrapping, but then are encased. But it does mimic that, and it gives a nice finish. If you're doing that, you need to use something quite fine, fairly strong. Um, you can just go ahead and work grappe or crochet. If you're working a crocheted button, you can go ahead. This is, which is what this is. Just keep going along the back, and that helps to hide up the back a bit. And let's see, what's that one? That's another, that is actually a decorative jewelry button fitting. They're quite hard to get hold of, but I have covered that with fabric as well, which in a way is a little bit of a waste because they actually tend to usually be sort of gold plated or silver plated because they're meant to hold a gem. But for this particular button, it did work best. And you can do something like that with a thread covered base. So this is a piece of card that I've spiral wrapped with thread and then attach that to the back. Of course, I've not gone all the way to the edge, and it would have looked nicer if I had, but you can see basically what's happening there. So those are some ideas for finishing. Let me move my little stands. And so what I'll do is I'll go over some of them and some of the different ideas, and maybe there'll be some that you don't know of. So the first thing to do is, I know that we had a little bit of a discussion actually on the group about signing your buttons. So if you want to make collector's studio buttons, usually the practice is to sign them. And so most studio button makers will quite literally sign the back of their buttons. And of course, with thread and fabric, that's not as easy. So I have some pieces of fabric that I have basically coated and let dry. And I have coated it from this side as opposed to the right side. So I've coated it from the back. And I basically laid them out on one of those non-stick sheets, just put some of each of these mediums onto it to see what it would turn out like. Now, the PVA is actually really shiny on the right side that's come through, which is very weird. So I would probably say that if you're going to use a PVA to do it, to put it on this way, I don't know, it could be the medium, the matte that I used, the non-stick matte, that made it really shiny. That does, when you write on that with a ballpoint pen, you can see it's quite dark. And so, and it writes, it doesn't sort of spread funny with a ballpoint pen. So it's a good option. But it does give it a little bit of a plasticky feel. And if you want to stitch through it, you might find it a little bit more difficult to stitch through it if you've used the PVA. It's not my absolute favorite, but it does work for some things. The second is I've used Slap It On medium, indigo blues. And again, I've coated from the wrong side. This is, it's not as shiny, it literally, it is a matte. So it's got a little bit more, I don't know, it feels different and it's very hard to describe. This actually feels stiffer than the PVA one. Of course, it does mean, all of these mean that you're not getting fraying on the edges. Um, when you write, it's not quite as dark as the PVA, but again, still perfectly clear and legible for signing it. And the third that I did was our lace starch, which or watered down Kansashi starch adhesive, whichever. They're the same formula. Lace starch is just, you know, a little bit more watery from the Kansashi. This one's very flexible, more flexible than the Slap It On, but still has a nice stiffness to it. Again, it is a little bit lighter when you write than the PVA. It's similar to the Slap It On. So either of those two, I think, would work quite well. To me, the starch feels a little bit more like you could still gather it up. So we'll experiment with those a little bit later as well, if we get time. So the first thing, and the first option, is that literally that is a piece of the PVA coated. Okay. And I have cut it out to line up a little bit along the edge of this particular button where the ridge from the blanket stitch is. Now you can go right to the edge, that's entirely up to you, or you can just keep it sort of within. Now for this one, I'm going to simply try to stitch it. This is the one with the PVA, and I am going to use a different cotton. So you'll be able to see my stitches, hopefully. But just to give it a try to see how well I think it feels, do this live for you. Help if I actually fasten that in. I like to use my thread singly when I'm doing stuff like this. It's just something that a habit I've got into. Really, you want to make your holes quite close to the edge, but I've come in a little bit. And of course, I'm just going to cover over, but what I'm going to do is fasten that, instead of going all the way through the button, I'm just going to fasten that onto the ridge of the blanket stitch all of the way around. Now, really, if you're going to sign any of these, you would be best to sign it before you sew it on, just because obviously that would be easier. And if you work not live, you can work nice little stitches. So you see, you can get quite small with this PVA coated without the edges sort of tearing or fraying. So from that point of view, that's really good. You could also probably, depending on the button, just simply glue it on. However, like I said, I prefer to use, even if I'm using glue, I like to be able to have some stitches because glues don't always stick very well to textile, although I have found that Slap It On when I've done mixed media projects has worked really well. So it's really up to you. Now, just before I finish this, come full circle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this. You can do, you'll get a tidier job if you do this particular bit first, but I've only just decided I want to do it now. And I've taken the needle through to the center, and I'm going to use a closed jump ring. And then that way I can have a little shank here. And because this has been strengthened, should be able to stitch that on quite well. This is a nice way to finish off a little button. Again, it's something that, you know, you can do beforehand, put all of these onto the pieces that you use for the backing, and any of the backings if you want to. A closed jump ring works really well as an option. Yes, do you know what, Chris? I haven't tried Mod Podge. I've never tried it before because I always have so much other stuff. And I actually contemplated ordering some, but it wasn't going to arrive on time, so I thought, oh well. But it's supposed to be really good, so I mean, people swear by it. I really must try some. Sorry, me looking at the questions at the same time is not really. I have to get used to it, guys. And so I've just come back down to the edge. And so you can see I'm only doing this quickly, but you can see that that really will cover up the most of your workings. And then you can just finish it off and take your needle through. Now, I was going to say, I almost thought I didn't bring my scissors in. Right. So get that into focus. We've got a nice little shank, slightly off center, but that will then give you a nice shank to add onto your button. Yes, Helen, I do use interfacing quite a bit. I like to use the non-iron stiff interfacing and cover it like it is a piece of fabric, actually. That really gives a nice shape to it. So I think that a lot of it is that you need to just think about what you've got, and then you can take it from there. So another entirely different option is, I don't know if you can see that, just maybe, tell you what, piece of cardboard. It's a 2-hole button, okay? Now I've got a bit of fabric, so I can cover that. And I'm going to simply cover the 2-hole button. Now you, again, this can work with a regular 2-hole button. Obviously you want something kind of thin. Well, I say obviously, you might not. Depends on what you're using it for, really, doesn't it? This, I have not coated this fabric or anything else. Just cut it out. And I'm going to run gathering stitches. So just like working any other cover button. But this option is one that can add a little bit of extra dimension and a little bit of an extra finish. And it's also helpful because you can use up scraps, but obviously you can also match. So I'm just going to cover up this button. I think that piece of fabric is perhaps a little too big, but I think we might just get away with it for the demonstration. I'm just going around to cover this so it looks a little bit tidy. Really, I should have used a slightly smaller. Usually I test it. Now, so we have that, okay? Just a regular covered button. Now I've got an eye pin from jewelry making. I don't think that's going to focus very easily because the light hits it. And I'm going to snip off the pinhead end, and I'm going to just gently bend it into a U shape. You see that? Hopefully you can just see that. And then that can go through the holes. We can find them. There's one, there's two. And if it won't poke through easily, you can always use an awl to poke through. In fact, I think I'm going to just poke that through a little bit further. There we go. You can do this with a single hole button as well as a double hole button. And obviously you could use it with a 4-hole button if you really wanted to and just put it through the two. This is the hardest part, is getting it through the back. There, it's just starting to come up now. Ideally, like I said, if you haven't got quite so much fabric there, it will go through a lot easier. There we go. And so, again, back to that piece of black so it will focus. Okay, so you take that down to where you want it to be. Usually, a lot of it will dictate by the spacing on the button if you have the two holes. If you're going just through one hole, it's a lot easier to make the shank a little bit more shaped. But what you can do to make sure it doesn't go down too far is to just pop a needle in there. Now what you need to do, and it's easier if you use pliers because you can get right down, is that you want to bend it out, which will make it hold. And again, if you're using it in a single hole, that is really important to bend it in the opposite directions. And then you just trim off the excess. Try to do that so it doesn't fly up and poke me in the eye. Then we have, let's see if I can get this so that you can see, just a little shank there, okay? And then that, again, I'm using a different color thread, so you'll see, but that can then be stitched onto any button that you want. Depending on the depth of this, will determine sort of what type of button you should put it onto. But I find that if you're using a button, using it on a ring can really help, because it's obviously, it's bringing it a little bit proud, but that can really work well. So let's just do a quick, and of course you can glue. You can do this particular method with paper. If you wish, you can use really anything. In fact, I'm not going to stick that on because I stick it. I'm not going to stitch it on because I have another one that is slightly thinner, but the same principle. And that is back to the interfacing, as Helen was saying. Now, this is a pelmet weight interfacing, so it's a heavier one. And it is actually an iron-on, but I never bother to iron it. But I'm pretty sure it does have the iron-on to it. And that, again, gather up. Now, this is a piece of the treated. So here's something that we can try. This one is treated with the lace starch. So we can try this together and see how this works. So again, I'll just work gathering. I hope everybody's keeping well. It's been a really warm day here again today. Kind of close and uncomfortable a little bit. What do you reckon? Are one of us going to win the lottery tonight? I'm just going to pop that in. Yeah, that lace starch works nicely, I think. It gives it a nice amount of stiffness without being too bulky. So that's quite pleased with how that lace starch has worked. It really is unusual weather. It's been, although it does feel autumnal now to me, I think, somehow. Even though it was warm. So I'm just going around that again in a little bit of a random circle just to tighten that round. And I will this time show you, as you know, that didn't have a hole in it or anything like that. So if we want to go ahead and put in wire in the same way as we did before, but what we can do, give it a little bit of a signature because it's been treated. Choose your center. And I'm going to do this with one hole this time and poke right through. Sponge, pillow, something like that, so that you don't poke your leg if you're doing it on your lap. Ask me how I know these things. And so again, I'm just going to bend. And I'll snip off some of that, first off that tail. Now this one's a little bit different because we want to squeeze them together quite tightly. Where'd that piece of paper go? So I'm going to squeeze it together quite tightly. Oh, that's great news, Helen. Yeah, the leaves are falling here too. And then I'm going to poke both of those through that hole. And you might need to force it a little bit, depending on how well you did. And that gives a different shape to the shank. So you have to ease it through to where you want it, which often means squeezing it together again. This is where you have to, you can use another stick or an awl or something if you want to as well. I'm just going to squeeze that together a little bit closer so that that comes down a little bit more. Then I'm going to fold it back again, just as before, but this time, because I'm only going through one hole, it shouldn't really collapse in, but just want to make sure. So I'll get another needle. Which one shall I use? I think I'll use that one, just to make sure it doesn't go all the way through. And again, you can use a stick or an awl for that part. And then I'm going to bend these, splay them back out. Now at this point, something I didn't say on the other one is that you can also, if you want to, add some stitching along here to further hold down these connections. So the part that you've splayed out, you could also stitch that down. So then we have a nice little back there. Get my needle and thread, which has a kink in it, so if you'll just bear with me. No, it's determined to stay there, so let me trim that kink off. Can always guarantee something will go awfully wrong. I am really pleased I managed to get online, and I'm so pleased that you guys have decided to join me and follow me to the second feed. So then that in itself can also be stitched and glued and or stitched to the back. And when I'm going to try to come up closer to this. When I'm stitching these, and I want to sort of be nice and careful, I will stitch sort of to the bottom edge of the back piece. And you can do this, this works really with any of the back pieces that you cover with fabric, but you can hide the stitches quite well. And that's the other reason why I like to use a single. You need a strong sewing thread, but if you use a single, it's a smaller bit of thread to try to hide, and you're less likely to get those, you know, when sometimes when you double up your sewing thread, one bit's longer than the other. That happens to me all the time. So using single, I kind of avoid it. And you can just stitch that to the back, and that will hide a multitude of sins. I've gone with a smaller one here, but you can obviously go quite close to the edge if you want to as well. Sorry, that's the bad thing about using single, is not paying attention and your needle coming unthreaded. And this, I think, also is quite a strong, by stitching any of the backings on, it does make for a stronger backing. As I say, I don't trust glue. I know there's some wonderful glues out there, but I tend to not use them properly. So, and that makes a really nice little, just a nice little shank at the back. And you can adjust that then as well. So if you're making buttons for a specific reason, so I don't know, to go through a knitted cowl and it's really thick, you could make a longer shank doing it this way as well. That it does make for a nice professional finish. And as I say, if you're using the starched fabric, it's even easier to sign. So, other options. Working in a similar vein, I have a ring, I have a circle of fabric, and I have a button. Now this button is actually, as you can see, smaller than the ring. But using the same principle, you can actually make like a border for your button whilst at the same time finishing the back, because the back is quite horrid. This is just something from an embroidery that never got finished, so I made it into buttons quite a long time ago. And it is still the same principle of backing. as before, and that is gathering up the fabric. I think for this one, let's see, I won't bother with the with putting a ring on it. We'll just use this as a flat back. I quite like the flat backs. They make for, to my mind, a nice clean finish on the back of a button. So I do tend to kind of go for that. Thank you, Janet. I still have to make my button for this week. I have an idea though. I have a plan. You guys have come up with some really awesome stuff, you know. I just enjoy tuning in and seeing what y'all are creating. So I've gathered that up and I'm going to work some stitching. Now, the ring ends about there. So I'm going to work some spiral stitching, but instead of going to the edge, I'm going to be closer in towards the ring so that in theory, none of my spiral stitching will actually be seen when I place the other button on top. You can also, if you prefer, so basically this is making a singleton. If you prefer, you can add a little bit of padding in there as well, so that this part is padded a bit. But I think the nice thing about using a ring is that if you have anything where you've got a buildup of thread or fabric at the back, the ring can also sort of help to cover it a little bit more. I know the feeling, Denise. I always seem to want to make something with something I haven't got. Oh, Kathy. We'll all get there in the end. It doesn't matter if you fall behind. You can still come on and look at all the lovely buttons other people have done. So what I'm doing here is just really pulling it up tighter and hopefully getting rid of some of the gathers. Now they're not all going to disappear because this is the back and this is where the gathers are. And so you would expect to see them here, but I can alleviate them along the edge just a little bit. So that's that. And now again, I could use some glue if I want to, but I can sandwich those together. And because it is a ring, I can push in a little bit with that bulk and then stitch these two together. And I'm stitching it with the gathered side up, facing the back of the decorative button, so that the back of the button altogether is smooth. So I will show you that in a moment. I won't let go yet. And I'm using very small little, I think some people call this a ladder stitch, where you go back and forth, so you create a little line. But if you use smaller stitches, then it will be more secure. The other thing that you could do, if you really, if you felt that your connecting stitches weren't quite invisible enough, is you could add a cord or couch some thread along the edge here to hide the join. And of course, if you do something really highly contrasted with the back, then it would create a different look again. Nearly full circle. And I like to, I don't know if whenever I finish off a thread, I like to sort of put it through, knot it, then put the end through elsewhere and pull up. And then if I pull it as tight as I can, the theory is that when I snip it, it'll snip back in and you won't have that tail of thread hanging. So it's just added a bit more depth and finished off the back flat. So you could sign that if you want to. You could add the jump ring onto the back if you wanted to. Of course, you can also do woven bars and woven loops as well. So that is something, that's a way that you can finish off to go larger than your button. Now, other ways. Something that I do, not overly, but something that I do is I have a button press machine. So these machines obviously are to create cover buttons. So it doesn't want to pick up. So you have the two pieces you cover with fabric, and then you use the dies in the machines to press it all together, and that's how you get a plain cover button. However, these backs that come in the pieces can be used to cover your buttons. And because of the way that they're designed, they have quite a deep profile. Some of them can be really deep depending on the shape of them. You can often pick them up in small packets. Thank you, everyone. You can often pick these up in small packets on things like eBay as well. You don't have to sort of buy hundreds of them all the time. And what they are good for is they're particularly good if you have a button with a lot of extra thread at the back and you want to cover that up. So you can actually just glue these directly onto the back of your button to finish it off. Because, for instance, like that, it's quite proud because I've used the stick method on this. And so that will then cover up all of that and you can glue that in. So as I say, you need to use a really strong glue. You could, though, in exactly the same way as with the others, go ahead and cover that from the back like so. So I'll do that quickly so you can see what that looks like. But as I said to you before, I didn't bring the right glue home. I left my super glue at work, my Gorilla Glue, which is what I do tend to use. But if you cover it with the fabric, you can also do the ladder stitches, you see. So that's quite a nice option. But then you say, well, what am I going to do with all of these? These too can be covered, and these can be covered for unusual ones. Yes, Denise, I have some that are almost perfectly flat, and they are really great as well because obviously they're not adding too much bulk. You just really have to look at sort of what comes with different ones. For me, because I have ones that go specifically with the dies that I have for the machine, for the button press, I have different ones, whether they're flat or not, sort of thing. Now, if you want to cover these with fabric, because often they're just either black or white these days, or you get the metal ones, and the metal ones are quite nice. But again, it's just covering with fabric. I know this is probably a little bit boring of just covering everything with fabric, but it does look different. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and show you this, and I'm going to show you one other one that's covered with fabric just to completely bore you. And that's to use the opposite side. Yeah, that might be the difference actually. The ones by hand might be the flatter ones. Um, yeah, that might be the difference. So when you're doing this, the shank side is what goes down. Okay, so it doesn't matter which type you're using. If you're using something that's like that, these are the ones that we have that are flat on one side. Whichever it is, you want the shank to go face down. Now, if you're using one that has a loop shank, you will need to make a little slit to place that through. Um, I would advise, if possible, to make the tiniest slit that you possibly can. It's not a bad idea to put a little bit of, say, starch or adhesive or fray check just at the very middle where you're going to make the slit, because that way you can just ease the fabric through, which is what I've done on this one. So that's a full on, that is one of these backs. And I think this is one of the flatter ones, Denise, actually. Um, the by hand, shove it by hand ones. um, and I've just made one little slit. You can just see. Now, this is kind of a loose fabric, so I didn't really need to make much of a slit. It then spread out to go around that loop. But as I say, if you, I'll just point to it with the tweezers. If you add a little bit of glue or fray check or something just at the side there. Now, you can poke through with an awl. I'll just show you on this. If you poke through with an awl and you get one of the tapered awls, the point of the awl is it's not going to actually cut the fibers. So often you can then pull and stretch them around, but it does depend on the fabric and the shank. So one of the tapered awls actually works better for this job. This one is too straight. That one's just a straight awl. Um, and that's what you can do. Actually, let's see if we can make it a bit bigger with that, so that it goes through without actually cutting any of the fabric. Nearly. And you just ease it through. But I think that if you make a little cut, but have a little bit of fray check or a little bit of adhesive or something like that, just to make sure that it doesn't come undone. But again, it's entirely up to you how you do that. So that gathered up again, nice and boring. I'm just gonna go around these edges a second time to make it a little bit tighter. And because it's got some space there, that will also fit some of this excess fabric. I know a lot of people will use just a piece of fabric. I do tend to like to cut circles, but I think that my obsession with buttons probably means I actually have an obsession with circles too. Yes, yes, an eyelet would look lovely and be a really nice finishing touch. It really would. Especially if you're doing very delicate buttons. I think that that would look really lovely. Genius. So then I've just got a little bit of a bump there, so I don't want that. So I'm just going to pull that gather, make sure it's quite even around the front. Yay. And then that, because again, I still have that, there's a lot of space there, so that can go into that bit. I can glue or I can stitch. Now, because this is thread, you do have to think about where you're placing your stitches, because there is always the possibility that if you pull too hard, you'll dislodge your thread wrap at the front. So you do have to be a little bit more careful when you're stitching a backing onto a thread wrapped button. And this goes with any kind of backing. I mean, the easiest thing to do on a lot of buttons is simply to do a felt circle, of course. And those are really good if you're going to make it into a brooch. And the card covered ones as well will work nicely for a brooch, because all you need to do is place your brooch pin on before you gather up the fabric, then gather it up, and then it's against that stiff background, and that works quite nicely too. But yeah, just with thread wraps, especially with some thread wrap designs, you do want to make sure that you're not dislodging any of your threads at the front. And again, this is by adding the fabric, another one that you could sign if you want to. And so that one, where's that piece of paper? And that's encased in all of that area. And then when someone wants to stitch it into place, then they will just go through the fabric itself. So that's like a couture way of doing the back. So that's another one. Now, as I said, but then you will have these pieces left over. These pieces can also, I've actually used, I think, the wrong circle. I think I should have used that circle with this, but let's see if I can manage to get this sorted. Now, what these can work really nicely for is to add a back to a deeper button or a smaller button. So find a button that will fit in it. Okay, so you can see that that adds a little bit of an extra. Now this, of course, is perfectly fine as it is, in the sense that any of the historical buttons, just keeping the threads as they are and everything showing, is absolutely okay and exactly what you would expect. But of course, these days we kind of expect everything to be really finished, because once they started using the presses to make all of the fabric buttons, they started to look neater and neater at the back. And so, of course, we kind of expect that now, especially if you're using. Well, that was not very helpful, was it? My threads just come all the way through because I didn't do my back stitches properly. You know, we've come to expect to have the back as finished as the front, just because that kind of gives it a professional edge. And as I say, you don't need to do that if you're doing anything historical. But I think if you're doing things, if you're doing nice sets to card up or as collector items, finishing off the back is usually quite nice. So this is a little bit harder to do, because when you gather up and sort of tuck inside, and it's not the easiest thing. but you sort of want to get it to go inside of the shape. So you don't want too much bulk, and you can add a little bit of glue. That will sometimes help. If you add a little bit of glue in there, it will catch down. Depending on the fabric that you're using, it can be quite helpful to do that. A little bit of a lump there. Don't want that lump on the side there. And then you will need to glue for the second part. You can use a little bit of stitching, but I would recommend gluing as well. Just fasten that off. There we go, that was easy. And then what I would do, let's see, let's get into focus here. So you can see, so it's a smooth domed back, and then you can glue that in. A little bit of a lump there that will irritate me, so I won't actually glue it, but you can glue it in, and then you're giving yourself a border. And so that can be really effective, and from the side, that finishes it off really nicely. There's a whole set of buttons that were created in this sort of shape around 1900, 1910. So a nice smooth back and then a domed top. And so that is a way that you can then use all of those bits where you use the back on something else. And also, you can put flat buttons into that as well. Obviously, you could put a ring in and then it gives it an extra finish as well. So that's I like doing that. I think it adds a really nice look. Hello, Paul. Right. And then just a couple of other little things to show you. And one I think that you possibly won't have thought of. So if you just excuse me for a minute while I take a drink of my tea. Okay, so a zwirnknopfe with very thin thread worked on a very thin ring. Why not add that to the back of another button? Again, you can stitch that onto the back. That gives something to stitch into, but it also finishes off the back really nicely. It's just a little extra thing and a sort of move on from the thread stitching, which I'll show you how to do that now as well. Now I'm going to use a pearl cotton on this. And you should ideally use something thinner. It does look better if you use something thinner. But I think if I use something thinner, you're just not going to see it. Yes, definitely. Double-sided pendants. I think that that's part of the thing. Any of your finishing techniques on your buttons makes them able to be used for other things like jewelry. I've added, this is a gathered back, a fabric button. And the first thing that I'm going to do is just work running stitches in a line. Try to space them pretty well. And I'm just going to go around the button. So hopefully, yeah, you can see I've used enough of a contrast. Obviously, you'd probably use everything to match. Matching is much nicer because then if you make mistakes, nobody else sees them. Seattle, 12:29. Lunchtime, 9:30 in Germany. So I've gone around once. Now I'm going to go around a second time, so a double running stitch in between the spaces so that we have a solid line or as near to a solid line as we can. It doesn't really matter because this will be covered up, so you don't have to worry about sort of super even. But this should help to protect your fabric. Nearly there. Sometimes I think it must be terribly boring watching some of this stuff, but I don't know if any of you are members of Lou Withers' Junk Journals and Mindful Mixed Media group, but I am going to be doing a live over there on the 8th, and that's going to be interesting because I don't think I'll be doing anything with buttons because they're mixed media journal people, so that's going to be fun. So now we need to work spirals. Now you can either work around your stitches, but what I like to do is to work just above the stitch. And then you come down to the next one. And obviously this is where using a fine thread is optimal. Oops. Throwing it at me. And you just basically work going around and around. So this gives you the thread covering of the back. Now by working the circle first, you don't need to pull too tightly because of course you've already done that by gathering up and making the button. So, but what the circle does is it helps to keep you a little bit on track so that the back stays a little bit tidier. I won't do the whole thing because I think that would probably be a bit boring for you because my brain won't let me do it too quickly. But you can see that that's how you can get, you just keep going around and around and around, and that's how you will get an effect like that one. I'll try to zoom right in so that you can see it. And of course, if you're using a matching thread, you barely notice it. So that can be done that way. Now, you're not going to be able to sign that, of course. So you have to think of other ways to sign it. Now, one of them is to use a small piece of the fabric. So for instance, if you've used the lace starch, you can cut yourself out a little tag and then you can just stitch a tag onto the back of your any of your buttons. And that's a nice way to be able to sign. Just a little stitch either side. Night, Helen. Say hello to your mother. And so that is how you can actually finish off. That is one way with that. Now you can take that on a step further. Again, keeping in mind, like the zwirnknopfe, you can also just cover a ring with thread. So you just go around and around and around, covering a ring with thread, and then that can be attached. And again, that is another good one. If you have a little bit of a bulky bit, that can cover that up. And I think that's possibly all of the different ways that I was sort of prepared to show you tonight. Hi, Dale. And so, is there any others that that you might want to see, or any other suggestions that you might like me to try out? Oh, and the other thing that I do sometimes do is I have these little teeny tiny tags. I have a little die cutting machine, and I will also put a tag on that I've signed, and then I will stitch it in on the back of a button. So that's another option for signing. And of course, you've also got your felt. So any button can have felt stitched to the back, nice and simply. Oop, my squeaky chair again. See, I managed to not move all night. And still, there we are. So shall I put those up, see where we're at, what we got to, what types of backs we've got. That's one of the ones that's card or a ring. You can do the same thing, covered with thread. So there's your thread options. Oh, I know, there was one more I was going to show you. There is one more I was going to show you. And this is working a grappe back. Chris, I think it might be an old tattered lace nesting die, like old, years ago old. And it's the tiniest in a set of all these tags that went down. I do a lot of felt circles too, so don't feel bad. I think it's a nice, easy way to finish off the back of a button. I really, really do. And, absolutely. So for this last one, again, I'm using a bigger thread. And I'm going to work now. Any of you have any of my embroidery kits, you know about working a blanket stitch at the edge. Now I'm working this right at the bottom edge. And I'm working it so the rim is just on the edge. You can do this in a few different ways, actually. And you can do this on fabric as well as on thread buttons. And of course, if you have, just have to be a little bit careful. On the thread buttons, it's going to ride down in the next stage that we do. So you do have to kind of manipulate it a little bit. But I'll just work some rough and ready blanket stitches. So I'll be annoyed with myself if I don't show you this one. Oh, sorry. Hopefully back on. I'll tell you what, Denise, if my hands only went off screen once, you guys are lucky. Oh, you should see when I'm doing YouTube videos. The amount of times I have to refilm it because I went off screen. And if you look really closely, there's dots all over the table, but I still end up forgetting about them. Okay, so nice, rough and ready blanket stitch all of the way around with the ridge pointing out to the back. Now I'm going to change to move that one out of the way. Change to a tapestry needle instead of to my long needle. And now I'm going to work the blanket stitch in. And of course you would do this with a matching thread, okay? It doesn't matter which you match to. But I'm going to now work a blanket stitch coming inward. And this is, of course, the grappe stitch. And this can be used to cover up the back, especially when you've got a lot going on in the back. and you're really not sure how's the best way, you just want to sort of cover it up, use a color that will sort of blend over. And you can do the stitches really close or really sparse depending on what the actual button is that you're trying to cover up all the stuff. Hi, Anne. Oh, yes. Ultra suede and leather. I just haven't got any handy, but you know, there are an awful lot of old buttons, older, I would say probably 50s and 60s, particularly, um, that you'll see beaded ones a lot that have leather. They actually have leather glued to the back as well. Very, very thin leather glued onto the back, sometimes with a little shank. You can buy in America little button shanks, which are just a little flat, very, very, very small. And then they have a shank. And again, they're used by button makers. I haven't been able to get hold of any, otherwise, you guys would see them in the shop. Um, you know, in not in wholesale prices, if you see what I mean. But yeah, that works really nicely. So they just pop up the shank, just the same as I did with some of the others. Just pop up the shank and then through a hole, and then glue the leather onto the back. And that is, you know, you see it. And as I say, that I've got a lot of older vintage buttons with that on the back, and you know, the glue is still holding. The big thing is just to make sure that your glue is good. There are still so many different ways. I think what you have to do is you have to consider what your button is, and what its use is. You know, if you're doing something that you want to be a studio button, a collector's button, then you'll treat it one way, usually, that you'll want to sign it. If you want to create jewelry, especially necklaces, you'll want to make something that is soft, that the back is covered and you know, can be worn against the skin nicely. Um, if you're making brooches, you'll want something, a back that's strong enough to hold the brooch pin. And then, of course, if you're doing something for garments, then that in itself will dictate, you know, what kind of garment it is, and so on and so forth. So basically with this one, you will just keep working around. I'm going to start skipping now, every other, but you'll just work around, work your grappe around the back. And you can see that that will cover up a multitude of sins. And as I said, on the thread buttons, it's pulling down a little bit because it is on a thread button. And you can counteract that if you want, if it really bothers you, by working a straight running stitch along the edge and anchoring your blanket stitch to that, and you just shore it up a little bit more. But as you can see, nice covering. Closing up now. And if you're into crochet, you can do the same thing. You can crochet an edge, a backing, and then voila, fasten that in at the center. And so if that is a nice matching thread as opposed to a contrast, you can see how that will cover up all of the bits. So that's where we're at. Right, well, I'm off. Not literally. But I do think my voice needs a bit of a drink now. Again, thank you all so much. I'll try to plan a few more of these and see if I can get this working a little bit better than the first time. And we'll go on from there. And hopefully I will get this loaded up in case you need to watch it afterwards as well. Thanks for stopping by, everybody.